Hi everyone. I've got a little tutorial here going over some tips for a sunlit interior render. But before that, I do want to say thank you so much to everyone that has subscribed and liked videos on this channel. Since the last tutorial, I've surpassed 10,000 subscribers, which just blows my mind. So thank you so much. And to show my appreciation, I'm releasing a pack of animated shadow gobos. These are going to be free to use, commercial, personal, whatever you like. These are 5 loopable linear EXR sequences. And I'm going to go over those quickly, how to set them up, and then we'll get into the tips and tricks on the sunlit interior. Thanks so much.
So real quick, I'm just going to go over setting up these animated gobos. I'm using Cinema 4D and Redshift, but this should be easily accomplished in any DCC or render engine. I'm pretty sure they all have options to do something similar. So I've got a basic scene here, just a couple walls and a dome light. And so what I'm going to do, I'm just going to go up and add an area light. You could also use a spotlight for this, but I'm going to use an area light and set this up. This and hit render. I'm immediately going to take the intensity down and I'm going to go to the spread. And I'm not sure, I think Octane has something similar here. We're just going to take the spread all the way down. We're just going to focus the area light into a narrow beam. And under the color tab, you see here, there's an option for a texture. And we can just go ahead and drop in the one of the EXRs here into this, but instead I'm going to go and add graph, and this is just going to give a few more options for the texture. So this created a new RS light material, and it automatically applied it to the area light. So I'm just going to click on this and dive in here to the shader graph, and I'm going to go to texture, just drag a new texture node out, and here's where I'm going to grab one of the EXR sequences. So I'm just going to click on the first one in the sequence and hit open, wherever that was downloaded from Gumroad. And I'm going to plug this in, the texture, into the general color section of the light. And you can see that is coming through. I'm going to make the light a little bit wider and just kind of angle it down a little bit to see what we're doing here. So under the texture tab, we have options here for the scale. You can kind of stretch this out. Like if we had a narrow window, but we didn't want the texture to be so squashed, you can just sort of scale it up along X and use the shape of the area light as sort of like the window itself. So you have some options here to kind of scale it to taste independent of the shape of the area light. That's kind of why I like the area lights here. And we can also, you can offset this as well. Right, so maybe something like that. And so now if I scrub the timeline here, you can see this is not animating. We need to go back up and just make sure you click on the tab animation, and I'm going to set this to loop and come down here and just do detect frames. You can see the end frame was automatically set to 757, which is the last frame of this image sequence. And so now we scrub around. It's going to be slightly different. Now, another thing I wanted to point out, under the general tab, we can change the gamma here to sort of adjust the look of this map. Like, you know, with a gamma of 1, this was kind of being blown out. We have the light cranked pretty high. This is replicating sunlight, so we want to do that. We can also come in and sort of clamp this down, and we can come back into our light and maybe increase the intensity a little bit and get this even brighter hotspot here, but still come back in and adjust the gamma a little bit more to bring in a little bit more darkness to the shadow area. And of course, you could always use a color layer here, layer these up, or, you know, also coming in and changing this from just color to temperature and color. That way you can dial in temperature and make this sort of a like golden sunlight or very cool You could layer up multiple versions of this, stack them up, and adjust each one's gamma. Tons of options. And just real quick, on the area light under shape, the spread right now is 0. So this is the fully sharp projection of the EXR sequence. Just sort of dialing this up a little bit, you can see how this starts to blur the projection. So I have control over how sharp that EXR sequence is. Of course, if there are any questions about this, leave one in the comments and I will be taking a look at those, trying to answer everyone's questions. All right, with that out of the way, let's hop over and take a look at our main scene. All right, so here we are in Cinema 4D and I've got my scene opened up, and really what I want to focus on is just the lighting in this. I'm not really going to go into models or textures, but what I do want to talk about is adding some complexity and realism to interior lighting. And basically what I've got here is I've got an area light that is acting as my window light source. And in that area light, I've got a texture applied where I'm using one of my animated shadow maps. And that is the main source and the brightest source of light in this scene. But I kind of want to point out what's going on here on the wall and also up top here. We've got this nice sort of breakup of light here and some pretty complicated looking shadows happening here. And we're getting all of this because I've enabled caustics on my light, and I've enabled caustics with a redshift object tag here for the floor. And so when we think about caustics, normally I think we think about refractive caustics through glass, but this is utilizing the reflective caustics. So this is giving us a much more realistic interaction of light bouncing off of the floor. And I've also gone ahead and added caustics to these chrome legs of the chair and this tabletop. And this is providing kind of an extra level of detail to the lights. And as you can see here in the before and after, where I've just got the Caustics version playing next to the version with just a more basic light setup with no caustics, you can see it's quite a big difference between the two. We have much more complicated things happening here. And normally for caustics, in the past, I've recommended not using an area light, but instead a spotlight for caustics to really focus the photons in a very limited area. Caustics can be quite noisy, and so we need a lot of photons to get clean results. In this case, because I'm utilizing an animated texture for the light, I wanted the caustics to match that. So I didn't want static caustics with an animated light source, so I am just utilizing caustics on this area light, which means I've got go to the details here. This is my main caustics light. And I've got my photons cranked up here to, looks like 99,999,000. So pretty high. I've also got the intensity set a little over half. I've got this light cranked pretty high. I'm replicating sunlight here, so that's something that, because we're using ACEs and we're using tone mapping, don't be afraid to crank your sunlight lights in your renders. That provides a much more realistic light interaction in your scene. So because I've got that cranked up so much, I thought that, some of the caustics may be a little bit too distracting. So I knocked it down to just a little over half, and it could come down maybe a little bit more. This is to taste. But I think the subtlety here adds just enough extra level of detail that I felt like this was working here at about 55%. Real quick, I did want to mention another important detail here. I was talking about these sort of complicated reflections on the wall from the floor. You can see this sort of like striation that's happening here a little bit. But that is also because I've got displacement enabled on the floor. So these floorboards, the divots sort of in between, are being displaced. That would not happen with just a bump map. With caustics, you need to have displacement enabled in order to twist and bend the reflection coming off of them. I don't believe that caustics recognizes just a bump map. So for your floors, if you had like polished like concrete, but you had like little nicks and things in it, it's important to use displacement map for those. Same thing with tile. Don't think you can just rely on the bump map for that. If you want the sort of more complicated caustic reflections off the floor, you're going to have displacement turned on. All right. Anyway, so I think I'm just going to quickly like kind of go through my scene here and what I've got set up, and I'll talk through some of the extra steps I've taken here and adding a little bit more detail to the lights other than just the caustics. So here's my scene here, and I've got just basically two walls and kind of this wood partition wall here in the back that's here. So I don't really have a built out geometry window. I'm just utilizing this area light. I'm going to turn off these other two, and I'll get into that a little bit later. But I've got this acting as the main window light source. And I've got this sort of angled down to get the light sort of coming across the floor and up the wall. You can see here. I do want to point out, though, that I am not rotating this around the z-axis at all. If I go to the coordinates, the banking on this is 0. You want to make sure that if you're going to be seeing the edge of the light and you want to use that as sort of the window barrier, that you're not rotating this around. Like, we wouldn't want this to be angled like this, even though the shadows may look nice. But really, if you're seeing this edge, that would mean that the window is built on an angle. So we want to keep the uprights vertical, matching the uprights in our scene. I've seen some renders where the window would have been built at an angle, like a 45-degree angle. So another thing I'm doing here, I've got some interior lights. I'm using IES lights here on the walls and a sphere light inside of this desk lamp and just a disc light that's set to visible in this lamp. But I really just want to focus on the exterior lighting. So I'm just going to go ahead and turn those off and kind of do a quick render here to show you what I've got. And I'm going to turn off bucket render. We're going to do this without caustics for now. So I'm going to let that render a little bit, but I just want to point out that this light here, right now, the only light source, I have a dome light here, but this is set to, under details, just provide reflections in the scene. And I just was doing that because I don't have any other walls here in the scene. So this is just sort of a black void. And I didn't like the effect I was getting on the chrome. If I turn this off, you can see this sort of goes much darker. And that's a judgment call. You could just as easily like build this out as like make like a real room or provide just some other planes or objects in the view for that chrome or anything reflective to reflect. But right now, this is the only light source. It's just the animated texture. And I've just done that in the light. You can just do the add shader graph button will add a texture to the light. And I've just gone ahead and loaded up the texture, and I've gone to animation and enabled this to loop and set detect frames down here. So this is all going to play automatically through the light, but we want to make sure that the light is set to temperature and color. And that way we can not only utilize this as a black and white map, but we can add a warmer color to this along with the texture. The other thing I've done here is bumped up the global illumination on this. I've got this set to 2 just to provide more bounce light in the scene. If I take this back down to 1, you can see the room gets a little bit darker. So I kind of want to add that extra warm bounce from the floor up onto the walls, from the chair up onto the walls. And I'll be rendering this out in AOVs. And of course, we can adjust this to taste when we comp the AOVs back together. But just as a starting point, I do like to increase the global illumination on the main light here. So another thing I'm doing is I'm copying this light and I'm turning off caustics on this. There's no caustics on this. And basically, I've just duplicated this light texture. It's the same animated texture, but I want to decrease the spread. And I should kind of point out here, the spread on this first one is set to 0. So this is just I can show you here. If I increase the spread, we can see just how diffuse this is getting. And for the moment, I'm just going to turn off the redshift environment. This is just a very subtle fog I'm adding into the scene, but for now, I'm just going to get rid of that just to show this light. So I have the spread set to 0. So I'm just utilizing this texture as sharp as it can go. But for the blurred, what I've done is increase the size of the light and increase the spread. So I'm just going to solo that light and show you the difference. I've got this turned down in exposure as well. And basically what I'm thinking here is that as light comes through a window, the window, it could be double paned, it's going to be dirty. There's going to be light that's a little bit more diffuse than just a very clean, very sharp projection. So because I don't have any window or glass or anything like that that's going to be interacting with the light, I'm going to fake it here with another light that's a little bit more blurry and a little bit different scale. So with both of these on, we can see here we're kind of getting this sort of bloom around the sharp projection of our texture. I think this goes a long way too to help sell this. Light coming through windows gets to be very complex. There's a lot of light bouncing around the window frame, going through the glass, bouncing off of objects around it, being scattered with particles in the atmosphere. So there's a lot of stuff happening here where we just don't have that in 3D space. So we need to kind of make up for it with, additional lights or some other tricks that we can kind of make things a little bit more complex and a little bit less clean. So that's my thinking here with adding this sort of blurred, different scaled version of our light projection. And because it's animated, it's going to be moving the same way as the sharp projection. The other thing I've done here, I've added a third one, and I'm just going to turn those off and just solo this one. And this light is just replicating some just very diffuse, kind of cooler skylight that is coming through the window. So probably have our sharp sunlight streaming through the window, but we'll also have like reflection of the sky and the ground and a very sort of diffuse light coming in. And that's what I've got here as this sort of bigger skylight, calling this cool sky. And I've just set the temperature to like 7,800 and increased the spread even more. So with these three on, kind of get a sense of what's happening here. We're getting kind of a range of colors, a range of temperatures, really, of the light, and a range of how diffuse they are. And I think that kind of helps sell the sort of complicated way light would be streaming in from the outdoors. I did want to point out, as I was doing this cool sky option, I kind of thought about a different approach that I want to hop into another scene and talk about. I think is pretty cool. So I'm just going to stop this. All right, so I've got a scene here with just a regular area light and sort of the same thing here, just a basic scene setup so we can kind of see what's going on here. So this area light, to replicate what I have in the last scene, I'm just going to change this temperature and, kind of do a cool temperature and increase the spread so we get something kind of like this. So maybe we want like a cool blue that we would mix in with another light. But then I thought, maybe there's a better way to kind of break this up because this looks very uniform as well. And I think if the goal is to just sort of add complexity and interest, there might be a better way to go. And I want to do that with a portal light. And I'm going to use a dome light for this. I'm just going to reset this. And basically I'm going to get a dome light. If I turn this on, you can see it's doing normal dome light stuff, but I'm going to go in and change this just standard bathroom HDRI. I'm going to grab like a sunset. All right, so now we've got this sort of bright, colorful sunset. If I zoom out here, you can kind of see it's just like a nice sunset HDRI. And I'm going to go in and add a redshift portal light. And I'm going to kind of move this up and over here. And these are a little bit tricky. We need to make sure this is pointed in the right direction. So I'm going to take the portal light, I'm going to take the spread down to 0, and we can see here we're shining light on our back wall. If I turn the rotation around and it's opposite, we get no light. So we need to make sure that this is pointed in the right direction. For now, I'm going to take this under the area light and just reset its transform so it's in the same position as our area light. And I need to lock this camera. There we go. Right. So if you look at this, our portal light is the same position as our area light. I'm just going to kind of make it like the same size here. Right. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go into the dome light and I'm going to take the the exposure down to -10. And I'm going to turn off our area light and our portal light, and there's no light in our scene. So we've basically turned off our dome light, taking the exposure so low that it's not really contributing to the scene. But if I go back to the portal light, I'll pull it out from under the area light and turn it on, I can take this exposure up to 10. And now we're just using our HDRI through our portal light. We're channeling all the light in the HDRI only through this portal light. And right now the spread is set to 0, so it's very harsh. But what I can do, I can increase this spread. And as I do this, we're sort of sampling more of our HDRI. And you can see here how the breakup of the shape of this is changing and the color. So if I go to the dome light and start to rotate this, you can see the color change we're getting from our dome light. And I think this is kind of a nice effect where we get this sort of different gradient to our light. And I think this is kind of a nice way to just kind of break up kind of standard clean window lights. This is, I mean, I could do this all day, but you kind of see the point here. Like, this is much different than, I turn on just the area light. You can see how sort of clean and uniform this is compared to our portal light. And just sort of rotating this around. If we wanted that cooler look, we could go sort of opposite of the sun here. Just sort of fake it. Something like this. We get a little bit of warmth in on the edges or something like that. It's kind of purple, but the shape is kind of unique and broken up, and the color gets some nice gradients. And as we change the portal light's spread, we get more and more color being brought in from our dome light. So I think it's kind of a nice effect, add more complexity to our scene. Real quick on the portal light, we can do this with a dome light. We can also do this with an environment texture. If I go to Redshift, Material, Environment, and in our environment tag, I bring in that same HDR map and go up to Redshift and Globals. There's a default environment spot here, and I can just drag this environment texture into that spot. And now we've got sort of the same thing that we had before in our dome light, but we need to go into the environment and then take the exposure back down to -10. And now we get a similar result. And we can control the rotation of the projection here in our environment texture around Y. So we get sort of that same control that we had. And we can adjust the dome light intensity with our portal light slider. It's kind of a pain to bounce back and forth here to go down to this rotation. So if you want, just drag this over into a viewport, and if you want to move this, hold down Control, you can slide this down. Now we have the rotation in the viewport to make adjustments. You know, so like something that like that looks really nice. We kind of get this sort of faked, like, you know, maybe this is our top of the window and we have some extra reflections going on, and the light breakup is kind of nice, and the gradient is kind of a little bit more complex than we'd get with just a standard area light with a temperature or gradient applied to it, just with a ramp or something like that. So I thought I'd share that with you, and I'm going to head back into the other scene and talk about a couple other things. In this scene, I'm utilizing a dome light here just for reflections. If I wanted to use that portal light in here, I wouldn't be able to do both. I couldn't have like an interior HDRI for reflections and a portal light with a sunset texture on it. It'd be one or the other. So in this case, if I wanted to use the more complicated portal light, I would just need to build out some more geometry here for the chrome to reflect. Or, you know, if you're building out your scene completely and not just taking shortcuts like I am, you wouldn't run into that problem. But the other thing I kind of wanted to point out was the lights I'm using in the scene. We kind of have to think about how bright these are going to be. Because we have so much power in 3D to like set the brightness of all of our lights, we need to think about how bright would this little lamp be in relationship to the sun. It would be way dimmer. And the lights on the wall and, you know, a desk lamp would be significantly less bright. And looking at this, I'm like, oh, I think maybe I probably could have lowered the intensity of these a little bit. If this is like a bright sun coming in and we're using a camera to just take a photo in this space, we would only be able to expose so much of the scene, right? So we have this full dynamic range that we're able to compress down into what the display can see. It's like what ACES is doing is taking the brightest highlights of the sun and compressing it down into a range that fits in our monitor. But in order to do the same thing in photography, we'd have to take a series of photographs to get that same amount of dynamic range. You know, it'd be like HDRI photography, where you'd bracket your shots and then combine them all into one image. In this case, if we want that look, that's fine. We can kind of just keep these brighter, you know, and not worry too much about it. But if we were going to imitate more like a photograph or like footage from a video camera, we'd have to think about how bright we really want these things. And these probably, in my opinion, are a little bit probably too bright. We kind of have sort of a little bit too even of an exposure. So it's maybe something to watch out for and just sort of think about how much power we're giving to each of these lights. If this was going to exist in the real world, you know, maybe this lamp is just too bright in comparison to the sun here. So like table lamp, you know, I maybe just like taking this down. Let's see here. So maybe a stop. And then the hanging lamp, maybe having it. And maybe these IES lights, maybe a stop. So you kind of see the difference. It's like, if the focus is the sunlight streaming through the room, then maybe this would be a little bit less balanced than it was. But just something to think about when constructing the scenes and thinking about what the intended goal is that you're replicating. You know, if it's HDRI photography, like a still image for like interior, like an interior magazine or like an architectural magazine, HDRI photography is used quite a bit. You're taking multiple exposures and combining them. If it's just a quick like run through with like an iPhone or something like that, yeah, maybe you'd want to not have the interior lights be so close to the brightness of the sunlight coming in. Real quick, I wanted to hop into Davinci Resolve and talk a little bit about ways to deal with caustics that are noisy in comp. So I've got my AOVs all split up here and recombined into the final image. If I go back over to the caustics section here, I'm doing a couple different things here to get rid of some fireflies in my render. But basically, if I hit 1 here, I can bring up just the caustics into this window here. And if I zoom in on this, you can kind of see how noisy this is. I'm not sure if this is showing up. I'm going to go up here to these 3 little dots and do gain gamma. And I'm just going to bring this up. And all this is doing is just changing the brightness of my viewport. This isn't editing my file in any way. It's just the way I'm seeing it. Just to show that what you can do now that these are split up into different AOVs is to do a noise reduction pass on a single AOV and kind of clean them up a little bit. Like reset this here. This looks a little weird. And I'm just using like some pretty default settings on the built-in noise reduction inside of Davinci Resolve Studio. That is, I believe, only available in the paid version, but just as easily you could use something probably a little bit better like Neat Video or some other plugin, noise reduction plugin. But it doesn't take much to just take that sort of dancing grain out of this AOV, and then once it's composited back in, just get this a little bit cleaner result. And I think by far the Caustics was providing most of the noise in this image. So just cleaning up that single channel helped with the overall noise in the final composite. I don't really like to use the render time noise reduction. I feel like that takes away a lot of the fine details in the render. So doing it this way, I think, provides a little bit more control. You can just sort of pinpoint where you'd like the noise reduction to be taking place the most, and then you're left with the finer details in your render.
So that pretty much wraps this one up. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you so much for subscribing and supporting this channel. Definitely stay tuned. I'm going to be releasing more tutorials here on YouTube shortly, but also wanted to let you know I've been working on a Patreon. It's going to focus around real-world photographic techniques and how that relates to 3D and 3D lighting. So if that sounds like something that might be interesting to you, definitely keep an eye out for that. So thanks again, and I will see you soon. Bye.